So for chapter 6, we're going to continue to look at some of the similar types of information. So we're going to continue to look at the different types of biomes we have in the universe, but now we're going to kind of see it from the perspective of how we can conserve different pieces of those environments, how we can preserve different pieces of the environment, and we'll see kind of how that's actually played out in a couple different locations as well. But just to start, so we have a background on what those terms mean, just as a little bit of a refresher. Conservation is looking to make sure that we sort of smartly use the resources we have present. And this is done in a way that's sustainable so that we continue to have those resources going forward. So for future generations, we can continue to have those different resources that we're going to need for whatever those applications might be. And then preservation is just essentially just not touching it, so staying away, essentially just completely protecting it. So similar ideas in that they're both going to protect the environment, help the environment, but they're going to do it in slightly different ways. Preservation is a little bit, well, it's a lot more hands-off, whereas conservation, we're still using the environment, we're still using those resources. We're just trying to do it in a smart, sustainable way so that we can continue to do it into the future. And then looking at the landscape of the globe, the forest, woodland, pastures, and rangeland, that's going to cover about 60% of the entire land on the planet. And those locations are going to be extremely important because that's where we're going to see the most biodiversity, and that's where we're going to get a lot of the resources we need for various things. So that's going to provide the lumber, paper pulp areas for livestock to graze, as well as these ecological services that we've talked about and we're going to continue to look at. So the forests help regulate the climate, they help absorb some of the carbon from the atmosphere, help stave off climate change a little bit. They help prevent water from running off. So we've seen that with different wetlands, but also the forests do that as well. And of course, they help actually protect and provide a place for these different organisms, these different species to actually live. And then just with forests, because we've got a couple different kind of categories up here, they would all look different, obviously. But just in general, in general, the forests, we're going to be looking at any sort of area of land where trees cover at least 10% of it. So 10% or more is trees. We're going to consider that just to be a forest. So it can look quite different if it's just a little bit over that 10% to something like a rainforest where it's going to be very densely populated with trees. But we're still going to consider those to all be forests. And then as we saw in the previous chapter, with these forests, we've got a couple different types depending on exactly where we're located, depending on exactly the climate they're going to be in. So depending on the temperature, the level of precipitation, so the amount of moisture that's going to be present in those environments, as well as the nutrients in the soil and a couple other factors. And then with these, the tropical forests, so the ones that are located near the equator between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, at about 23 degrees latitude, both north and south. These are going to be important because, as we've seen, extremely biodiverse areas, because we do have those warm temperatures, we do have extreme amounts of moisture. So they're going to give us a large amount of biodiversity, but from an environmental aspect, again, they're going to help with the carbon capture within the atmosphere. So these trees are actually going to essentially absorb some of that carbon dioxide from the air, going to help stave off climate change a little bit. And then we'll see this to some degree with the other types of forests as well. So temperate forests, similar to where we live in Washington, also going to be a pretty good capture of the carbon in the air. The boreal forests, so the ones in the very north, so up in Canada, into Siberia as well, so Russia, and then parts of Europe. Not going to be as great at capturing the carbon storage, or capturing the carbon, I should say, storing that carbon. So they're not going to be as effective at sort of offsetting some of the global warming that we're experiencing currently. And then just with this, not exactly related to the forests that we would typically think about, but what you can also see is just in this bottom here, you can see exactly where we're replacing some of these forests with just cropland. So a lot in the Midwestern United States, you can see pretty much all of Europe and into like Eastern Europe into Russia, India, quite a bit here, as well as parts of Asia. You can see it a little bit in Africa, not quite as much as the other locations. Same thing with South America and Australia. But you can see we're replacing a lot of these forests with cropland. And that's going to be a negative impact just because we're going to be losing some of that biodiversity. And then when we plant those crops, they're usually going to be much less diverse. So it's usually just going to be a couple of crops at most. There may be some organisms living within those crops, but it's not going to be anything close to comparing to what we saw with the different types of forests. And then one type of forest we're going to focus on, or one class, I guess, if you want to call it that even, is going to be what's known as old growth forests, also known as primary forests or frontier forests. And these are going to be important because these are going to be essentially completely undisturbed from human activity. That doesn't mean humans aren't going to be present. In some cases, there may be even indigenous tribes that sort of live in these forests. But with the human activity, what we're saying with that is just they're not going to be drastically changed by human activity. And with these, because they are undisturbed, they will have large amounts of biodiversity. And they're also going to generally contain a lot of those endangered species. So these are going to be kind of unique landscapes. And then because of that, they're going to have those endangered species just living with it. And we can see just a map of where some of these are going to be located. So we've got a lot of them in different parts of South America, a couple in Africa. And this isn't all of them, but the major ones. And then a couple out into Asia and Oceania, again, Russia, United States, and Canada. So with these are going to be the forests that are going to be essentially untouched, just unchanged by human civilization. With the South America ones, like Brazil, we've got the Amazon rainforest. The one in the United States is going to be in the Rocky Mountains. It's going to be extremely isolated. So it's going to be difficult to get there. And because of that, it's going to be mostly unchanged. And then the thing about these old growth forests is they typically provide sort of extra ecological services compared to other forests. And by that, I just mean they're better usually at storing carbon. They play a more important role in the cycles of different nutrients, the cycles of water, so the hydrologic cycle. And again, they are the foundation for a lot of the biodiversity. So the Amazon rainforest is the most biodiverse location on Earth. That's going to be one of these old growth forests. But the issue with them is forest deforestation is occurring everywhere. And globally, deforestation has reduced about half of the total forest area. But the old growth forests in particular have been reduced to just 25% of what they originally were. So these ones are being more dramatically reduced than just the typical forest area. And with this, we also do have to kind of balance the preservation, the conservation of these areas with the need for different resources. So like we do need wood, we do need lumber. So we do need to kind of, at least to some extent, we do need to chop down trees. So again, lumber, paper pulp just is used in papers, kind of like the cellulose material in trees. Fuel wood is just used for exactly what it sounds like, fuel. But the extent to which we're doing this is problematic because annually wood is consumed at a higher rate than steel or plastic. And an issue with this in particular is that of that wood consumption, 80% of it is done by the developed world, so the richer countries, places like America, Canada, Europe. But those countries are also only producing not even half of that supply. So those countries, the richer countries, again, are the ones that are using most of the supply, but they're not supplying it themselves. And the issue with that is it becomes the less developed, the poorer countries are now supplying their natural resources to these richer countries. And that's just going to be a somewhat unethical practice because it's sort of just taking advantage of that situation. They kind of need the money. And they're losing biodiversity. They're losing just natural beauty in their countries. And they're just getting sort of taken advantage of in those scenarios. So that's going to be another aspect that has to be considered in this entire just sort of framework of this chapter. And then with deforestation, there is the opposite, reforestation. So we do hopefully want to repopulate these areas if we can replenish these areas. And in temperate regions, again, kind of like where we are, the ones that don't get extremely hot, extremely cold, just sort of the moderate areas. In those locations, in general, we are seeing more trees being planted and just regenerate naturally than are getting cut down. So there is a sort of a net positive in terms of the overall tree sort of population. But the issue with this is generally when the trees are planted, what's typically done is they're just going to plant the same type of tree uniformly. So it's just going to be that one species. That's called monoculture forestry. And excuse me, the issue with that is it doesn't really introduce the biodiversity that was already present in that natural environment. So with the natural environment, you're going to have a variety of different trees, and then you'll have the different organisms living within that environment. But now when we come through and actually just do this monoculture forestry, we just plant that one type of tree. Now we're just going to have that single plant. We're not going to be able to reestablish quite as diverse of an area. And we're not going to have the same level of productivity, stability, or resiliency in that environment. And then that all kind of just boils down to that environment just isn't going to be as effective at providing those ecological services. So being a habitat for a lot of different types of organisms, it just won't be able to successfully do that. It won't be as successful as controlling erosion. And with that, we also won't have as clean water supply. But with the reforestation, it has been successful in a couple of different locations. Again, there has been the net positive just in temperate regions overall. So that is a good thing. Again, we could do it better, but at least it is sort of an increase in the tree population. And then similarly, we've seen in China in the past couple of decades, they've planted over 50 billion trees. And the reason they did that is because over a millennium ago, so 1,000 years, they cut down most of their forests. And that led to a lot of soil erosion, a lot of flooding. So it caused a lot of issues in China. And now planting those trees, hopefully they'll be able to better protect that soil, better protect that environment, sort of more easily control runoff from different precipitation events, and hopefully just get a better handle on the environment as a whole, sort of reestablish that ecosystem and improve that biodiversity at the same time. And then similar things occurred in Japan and Korea after World War II. So those areas were somewhat devastated by the war, including the trees, obviously, and then they were able to reforest those areas. And then tropical deforestation. So we've talked about this a little bit in a couple of different chapters already, focusing on the Amazon. So the darker country here in South America, that's Brazil. But you can see there's a whole bunch of different countries that experience this, and this is just focused on the tropics specifically. So kind of just the middle of this graph here. Whereas we can also see the boreal forests up north, and then not all of these are going to be tropical rainforests as well. But we can see just the extent to this deforestation. The darker the color just refers to larger scale deforestation in those countries. And again, we've talked about it a little bit, but the issue with this deforestation is that it's ultimately going to create a positive feedback loop. Deforestation is ultimately going to lead to further deforestation. And the reason for that is because the forests themselves actually stabilize the environment. And one thing that's pretty cool about the rainforest is that the rainforests actually provide some of their own rain. So if you think about just the rainforest, and you can get a kind of idea from the little diagram we have here, there's going to be such a dense population of those plants, and there's going to be so much precipitation, so much moisture, that the plants themselves are going to lose water just through transpiration. So just losing it through the holes in the bottom of the leaves, essentially. And the process we're going to be referring to here is evapotranspiration, so losing the water through those leaves and having it evaporate up into the air. What that's going to do is then provide the moisture for the precipitation. And what they've actually seen is that it's rained in the rainforest before the air currents could actually even bring moisture from the oceans to those areas, just sort of proving that the precipitation in some cases is coming from the rainforest itself, coming from those plants. So when we remove those plants, now we're going to be removing some of that moisture. We're going to be removing some of that rain. We're going to wind up with a drier environment. That's going to lead to more soil erosion. That's going to lead to less trees being able to survive there. That's going to lead to less carbon being absorbed by those trees, which is going to further global warming, which is then going to make a even further drier environment. So we're just going to kind of see all of this start to snowball and lead back to one another, kind of just, as we've said a couple times, a positive feedback loop. And then in addition to just the inability to absorb carbon from the forest that's no longer there, another issue with deforestation is that when these areas are cleaned, and by cleaning, or clearing, I should say, not clean, but when these areas are cleared, they're oftentimes burned as well. And those combined processes are going to release a ton of carbon back into the atmosphere. And those processes actually total almost 1/5 of the annual emissions of carbon dioxide. So 18% of the carbon dioxide production on an annual basis just comes from these clearing and burning activities, which again is just going to further lead to more global warming, lead to more deforestation, and then again, just that feedback loop of repeating over and over, back and forth. So one thing we're going to look at when we get to air quality is something called carbon capture. And it's not exactly what they're showing here. You wouldn't really have the carbon dioxide leave the power plant and then capture it somewhere else. You would kind of do it in the power plant itself. But it is just showing that general idea where we're going to have the dirty air run through these carbon capture technology devices. And then we're going to store that carbon dioxide underground, usually. And that's just going to leave us with the cleaner air for the environment. The thing with it is, though, this is an extremely expensive process. So to currently do it with the technology that's available, it's estimated to take about $130 for every 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's captured, that's not escaping into the environment. But then when it comes to preserving the environment, what they did was they, I forget which organization it was, but they paid farmers in an African country to sort of work to preserve the environment while also going about their normal daily business. And what that wound up working out to be ultimately was much, much cheaper. It wound up to only costing not even 50 cents per ton. So it's a dramatically cheaper process to kind of just preserve and conserve rather than try to fix the process afterwards. And the reason for that is because preserving and conserving these resources allows further protection of the environment. So again, the forests themselves provide ecological services, and that's why we're seeing this reduction in cost between just preserving the forest and capturing the carbon, is because the forest just already does so much of this stuff itself that it is really just a huge plus to the environment. It's a huge plus to the planet. It's a huge plus to humans and all organisms on the planet. And then similarly, I should say, there's something known as RED, so reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this goes back to the idea that most of the lumber and the paper pulp, most of the wood that's being deforested comes from less developed countries, comes from poorer countries, but then is shipped and is used in richer countries, more developed areas. So what they did is establish this program. And it essentially is a program that's trying to incentivize those lower income countries to pursue economic opportunities that aren't going to necessarily, or that aren't going to require they clear the forest or they sell that forest for other uses. So agriculture, sometimes it gets cleared for just development in general. So making sure that we're protecting that those ecosystems in those poorer countries. And the reason we want to do that is because a lot of the times these countries, when we provide that protection, it's going to give them access to cleaner water because they're not going to be, in some cases, like mining or just clearing the forest, which can lead to pollution. But it's going to preserve the biodiversity. That's also going to help keep the environment clean. So if you have access to clean water, that's going to provide stability because it's going to make sure that people aren't getting sick as often. It's just going to make sure that people are, in general, at least a little bit happier than if they had dirtier water, obviously. So that's going to help create sort of a more stable environment. But then also, this program incentivizes what's known as ecotourism, which will come up in a little bit. And it's essentially just what it sounds like, tourism based on ecology. So just going to view something in nature. And what this program allows people to do is protect that ecology, protect those environments. And it's actually in the long term, a more sustainable process. It's going to, in the long term, provide more for those countries than if they were to actually just exploit the land for those resources in the short term. And then in addition to the problems with the rainforest, there are issues with just the temperate forest. So again, stuff like the ones that we currently live in. With these forests, so the temperate forest, there are the most standing biomass per unit area in any other ecosystem. So even compared to the rainforest. But with these, and these problems aren't exclusive to the temperate rainforest, but just some of the stuff that we see coming up, there are issues related to logging, farming, hydropower, fishing, so salmon especially, the rights of native the native communities, and then just protecting the wildlife in general. So again, we've seen this in a couple different areas, but just trying to balance all of these different factors, some of them environmental, some of them social, some of them political even, and then of course, economic issues are gonna kind of always be present. And then with these temperate forests, one thing that's an issue is preserving the biodiversity. Like I said, there is a general net increase in the total population in these types of temperate forests, but we've seen the monoculture forestry is an issue, just because it doesn't replenish the biodiversity. Essentially, it's just putting one species of tree there rather than creating a diverse ecosystem. But in addition to the monoculture forestry, one thing that's important is what type of method is used in terms of clearing that area. Clear cutting is just essentially cutting every tree in the area. Shelter wood is just removing the mature trees. Strip cutting, I didn't fully finish that definition, but strip cutting is going to be cutting all trees in an area, but it's just going to be in sort of narrow bands rather than just a large swath of trees. And all of those have issues in terms of decreasing the diversity within a given ecosystem. So with the most sustainable practice is going to be in terms of removing trees is going to be what's known as selective cutting. And in this method, what's going to be occurring is only mature trees are going to be removed, but it's not going to be every mature tree. It's only going to be a very select number, and it's going to be done in rotations of every 10 to 20 years in order to properly maintain those populations while also maintaining the biodiversity in that area. So not only are we going to make sure that we keep the the supply of wood sustainable, so we keep that, but we're going to keep the biodiversity, and we're essentially just going to keep the sort of the characteristics of that area. The not the same, because it'll probably change just over time naturally, but we won't just be destroying it ourselves like we would with some of these other methods of removing those trees. And then with the forests, we've seen this quite a bit over the past couple of summers, especially. I don't know about here, especially because I lived in Utah. It was a pretty big deal there, especially with Colorado and Nevada on both sides. A lot of fires in both of those states in particular, not too many near me in the northern part of Utah, but the smoke obviously travels. I'm sure you experienced it up here in Washington as well. But with these wildfires, they are a natural process, at least to some degree, because what they're going to allow the fire or the forest to do is to regenerate, and it's actually going to clear out some of the debris that's present in the forests. And that's going to prevent a larger fire from occurring. So it's actually a good thing if it occasionally has a series of smaller fires, just to kind of keep the area clear of some of that debris. But if it builds up over time, now it's going to be more susceptible just to a very, very large fire that could be extremely damaging. And like I said, we've seen the occurrence of these fires, the frequency increasing over the past couple of past couple of years, especially. And again, it's going to be due to the climate change. So with the increased temperature, we're also seeing a decrease in the amount of precipitation. So we're just leading to drier conditions overall. It's going to be easier for something to spark, for something to catch fire, and that's just going to give us the forest fires that we've been seeing. And then in some cases, they also are man-made. So you may have seen there's been a few, I think at least two, caused by, what are they called? The gender reveal parties, whatever they are. They go, I don't know why they do them in the forest, but something went wrong with a couple of them, and then they did start forest fires that cleared pretty substantial areas of land. But for the most part, these will be natural in the sense that it's not going to be somebody starting a fire, but they are occurring more and more because of human-caused global warming. And then the next piece is going to be the grasslands. These occupy about a quarter of the global land, and with these, grazing can be sustainable on these. So with the grasslands, hopefully we're going to see something similar to what we've got on the right here. We actually see sort of the prairie grass and the different animals grazing on it. In this case, it looks like a bunch of cows. But what can happen if that grazing isn't done correctly, or in some cases, just because we're seeing desertification of a lot of different ecosystems just because of global warming, what we can wind up with is a dry, arid environment like this, where we're just going to wind up with a lot of sand. And like it sounds, when desertification occurs, we're going to wind up with a desert in that environment now. And with this, the grazing, overgrazing is going to be a problem, because obviously that's just going to devastate the vegetation. And then it's going to reduce or it's going to erode the soil. It's going to make it more difficult for anything else to sort of grab hold in that environment. And that's why we see the desertification occur. So when this process started to happen, especially in the Midwestern and Western United States, well-intended people trying to protect those environments, trying to protect them from becoming deserts, what they did was they prevented all organisms from grazing in those environments. And they also actually saw desertification occur there. So in this case, what we're seeing is the same location, about 41 years apart. And we can see it actually became a more desert-like, despite the fact that there was nothing actually grazing on these. And the reason for that is going to be because overgrazing and undergrazing are both going to be an issue. So what they figured out was the best way to go about it was to actually go back to sort of what animals are going to do naturally when they graze. Because the reason, so the reason that if we're overgrazing, the reason it can end up like this is just because they're going to eat too many of those plants, and they're eating those plants in one location. The reason that if we're undergrazing, it can wind up like this is because there's nothing coming along and kind of disturbing the soil. So what happens is there's actually going to be sort of like a film that grows upon it, a crust almost, that's going to make it difficult for the plants to grow in there. But in the natural process, what would occur is the different organisms are going to come in, they're going to graze, they're going to sort of stir up that land. They're not going to allow that sort of crust, that film to settle. But then they're going to move to another location without completely eating everything in there. So the way they've kind of tried to approach this desertification is by mimicking the grazing process of those wild animals. And the way they do that is with, and that's what we're actually seeing here. So this is, again, just another location. This one had already been turned into a desert essentially in 1974, but they used the process of rotational grazing to sort of desertificate it. I don't know if that's the correct word, but essentially just to turn it back into the grassland that was in the past. And again, the way they did that was this rotational grazing. And it essentially just mimics the process of the wild herd by keeping them in a location for a couple of days. They're going to graze in that one location, and then they're going to get moved to another one. This is going to allow for the proper level of grazing. So it's going to allow for the biodiversity to remain without the crust sort of forming on that soil layer. So that's going to be the best case sort of scenario for these environments. But it should be noted that this won't work in every environment. So like the Southwest desert, like Arizona and places like that, you won't be able to use this process there just because that area was adapted for the desert. So the plants that are already there were adapted for that kind of environment. So if we bring a herd of animals in there to graze, they're just going to destroy those plants. Whereas with the plants like this, they were designed, or they were adapted essentially to be grazed on. So that's why we can make it work there. And then in addition to that rotational grazing to kind of protect those environments, protect against soil erosion, in some cases, restoring fire can be helpful. So just like with the forests, fire is a natural process. So if it's used correctly, it can help protect these environments by sort of removing some of that debris. And then in addition to those two, another way to protect the grasslands is to raise wild animals rather than traditional livestock, because the wild animals, they're going to be already adapted for those environments. So they're already going to have the natural grazing patterns for those environments. They're going to have their water needs adapted for those environments. Whereas if you're raising something that's not traditionally found in that area, they may need more water than can be easily provided there. So that's going to be an environmental issue. It's also going to be expensive. If they need more food to graze on than the environment can provide, that's going to be an ecological burden on the environment as well. So switching from just sort of the traditional livestock to something that may already be present is going to be another option in terms of protecting these environments. And then just in general, there's going to be throughout the world, about 17% of the global land is protected in some sort of park or preserve or wildlife refuge sort of status. And depending on exactly what country you're in and exactly where you are, because even in the United States, different locations kind of have different designations in these groups here, which is going to give them different levels of protection. And that's going to mean different activities are going to be allowed in certain locations that aren't allowed in others. And the reason for that is to try to balance the protection and the conservation of those conservation and preservation of those ecosystems, while also balancing the human recreation, tourism, and other things like that. And then with these preserves, they do, as they suggest, preserve different environments to a different degree. But with them, there are issues. So depending on where you are, like I said, the level of protection differs. And a lot of times in more or in less developed countries, the level of protection is going to be diminished. They just may not have the resources to adequately protect those areas. And in that case, you may see poachers and just other illegal activities going on there that are going to be negative to the ecosystem. Even in America, so if you go up to Alaska, there's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And then currently and pretty much all the time, there's a bunch of companies that are trying to get permission to drill in that area. Luckily, they haven't been able to yet. And there's actually a native tribe that is, along with other people, but they're doing some of the main work in sort of protesting and trying to protect that land. And then with these parks, I would say in general, they're positive, but there have been some issues. So in the United States, the park system was developed in, I think, around the 1930s. I don't remember the exact year, but I think it was approximately then. And during that time when we were first started sort of setting that up, one thing they worked to do was suppress fires. So they wanted to protect those areas and make sure that people could go in them. And fires obviously are going to be dangerous. But when they did that, they were sort of disrupting a natural process, because like I mentioned, wildfires are something that when they occur naturally can be good. So by suppressing those fires, preventing them from occurring, they were allowing that the woody debris within the forest to build up. And that process just ultimately increased the likelihood for extremely large fires. And that's what started to occur. And then similarly, there has been some instances where different animals and different populations have become accustomed to humans and even sort of reliant on them. And that's negatively impacted their behavior. That's negatively impacted, in some cases, their population numbers as well. And then not really a negative, I guess. Depends on exactly kind of how you're thinking of it. But they do, some of these parks, so Yellowstone in Wyoming, Yosemite in California. There's a couple in southern Utah, Olympic National Park. So a lot of these places are going to be sort of tourism, maybe not hot spots like other locations, but they're going to get quite a bit of activity, and that can be a negative in terms of just sort of disrupting the solitude that's naturally in those environments. Because with it, we're also going to see that the protections on those parks often only apply to the park itself, and you're often going to see trees are cleared right up to the boundaries of these parks. Mining in some cases is going to occur directly outside of these parks, which is going to lead to contamination, especially of the water within these national parks. In Arizona, for example, there's a power plant very close to the Grand Canyon. And then that power plant actually pollutes the air at the Grand Canyon. So it's sort of reducing the beauty of that environment in addition to just negatively impacting the health of any organism that's going to be exposed to that pollution. And then some of the recreational activities within those areas can be damaging. So snowmobiles and ATVs have the ability or the possibility to damage that soil, to erode it, and that can lead to negative impacts on the plants in that environment and ultimately the ecosystem as a whole. And to kind of combat some of these problems as a whole, we've got a couple simple steps that we just want to make sure whenever we're developing, and I say we just as the royal we, referring to just humans in general. But when plans are being put in place, environmental plans are being put in place, there's a couple of rules that we kind of want to make sure that we keep at the forefront in order to make sure that those plans are going to be successful and those plans are going to achieve what we're hoping to achieve in terms of conservation. And the first one is to maintain that the essential ecological processes remain intact. So again, with the forests, that's the carbon storing from the atmosphere, the prevention from, or the reduction in runoff. So it helps with flooding, helps with soil erosion. So it helps keep that environment intact. And that's what we want to make sure we do when we're protecting these systems. Similarly with the genetic diversity, now we're thinking about the ability to withstand different disasters. If we've got genetic diversity, now we're going to have variation within the population, within those species. So if something does come along and disrupt that environment, the more diverse it is, the more resilient, the more stable it's going to be. So the more likely it's going to be either be able to sort of survive whatever that disturbance is going to be, or reestablish itself after that disturbance if it's something very dramatic. And then the final one, we want to make sure whatever practices we're putting in place are going to be something that's sustainable. So something that we can keep doing, something that's going to allow us to maintain the level of resources we're going to need into the future. So rather than something that's just going to cause the supply of those resources to run out in the short term, this is going to be something that's thinking long term, something that's thinking ahead generations and generations to make sure that the environment is protected for everybody that's going to come after us. And then with this, we've been focused predominantly on the terrestrial ecosystems, so the land-based ones, but the marine ecosystems also need protection. One of the main issues with this is just overfishing. So the global populations of fish have dramatically decreased. And then with this, comparing the amount of land that's protected to the shoreline, only about 5% of the global shoreline is protected, whereas about 17% of land globally is. So it's about 1/3 the amount. And then with this, we're not going to get too much into the details of these marine ecosystem right now, because we're going to look at chapter, I think it's 9 maybe, but one of the later chapters, we're going to be focused specifically on water quality. So when that chapter comes around, we'll kind of focus on the marine ecosystems a little bit more closely. But yeah, with these, for the exact same reasons, we want to make sure we protect these, keep the environments diverse. That helps protect them. And what they've actually seen already is in some of the protected marine environments, they've seen twice as many species in those environments compared to non-protected ones, just showing that the biodiversity is going to be extremely fragile, but it can be protected in these different areas. And a lot of the different factors are going to affect these ones as well. So climate change, agriculture, the runoff from that is going to impact the water quality, which is then going to impact those systems. And then one thing that I just want to make sure that we talk about, and we're not going to focus on it too much, is just the economic aspect of this. So just remember that in pretty much everything, ultimately it's going to come down to money. If there's not enough money for something, it just ultimately is not going to get done. And I mentioned the RED program a little bit already, ecotourism. With this, I just want to reinforce the idea that a lot of the times the places that are going to be most negatively impacted by the extraction of these resources is going to be those are going to be those developing countries. And the reason for that is because they kind of have to balance the short-term need for survival in terms of getting the money they need for the resources they need to actually survive in the short term, rather than being able to think as long-term and protect those resources. So one way that they can kind of go about doing this is through that ecotourism. It allows them to protect that environment, and it's also going to be a sustainable practice rather than just mining those areas. Eventually, you're going to run out of those resources. You're also going to be destroying the biodiversity at the same time. So it's really just a terrible situation for those countries to be in. But things like ecotourism, like that RED program, do offer at least somewhat alternatives for options in terms of protecting those different environments that are so important for the global biodiversity. And then finally, one thing to consider, because we've been looking at different like parks and things like preserves the last half of this chapter. One thing to consider is when sort of designing these parks and preserves and setting up the rules and the guidelines for how they're going to be run and what's allowed in them. There's a lot of considerations like we've seen. One of them is going to be that a lot of the times the protection of these lands negatively impacts the people that already lives on them. So the indigenous people, the native people from those different communities. So one thing that needs to be considered whenever this sort of process is done is how can they be treated ethically? How can they be treated fairly? And a lot of the times allowing them to remain on that land would be beneficial because these communities have lived there for such a long period of time. They've gained so much ecological knowledge just by being present, by being part of that community, that they actually sort of know how to best survive and how to best handle, how to best take care of that land. And one example of that is currently in California. I mentioned this in a previous video, but currently in California to combat the wildfires. They are using Native American techniques that were used previously that actually were banned by the local governments in order to prevent fires. Now they're actually sort of using those practices. They're trying to get an understanding on what the Native Americans did to try to get a handle on that wildfire. So a lot of the times allowing those indigenous people to remain on the land would be beneficial, obviously, for those people, because now you're not removing them from their homes, but also you're going to allow them to sort of use that knowledge to help protect the environment as well. And obviously that doesn't fall entirely on those communities, but a lot of the times they do have the experience and the knowledge to help protect those environments. And then in addition to those types of considerations, you also have to consider the size and the shapes of these parks. And that's going to actually have a larger role, a larger impact than you might expect on the biodiversity that's going to be present. And we've already talked about this a little bit with the island biogeography. So the more remote and the smaller an island is going to be, the less biodiverse that it's likely to be, just because it's going to be more difficult for organisms to get there. And then as organisms become extinct, there's going to be less new organisms essentially replacing them. So we're going to see the biodiversity decrease there. And that's what you need to consider with the parks, because essentially the parks themselves are going to operate as these islands. Because if you think about a national park, it's going to be this area of wilderness, but a lot of the times it's going to be surrounded by man-made communities. So it's going to be somewhat isolated from the other national parks. And in that sense, it's going to be kind of like these different islands. So when they're constructing these parks, they need to kind of consider exactly how they're going to set them up. And then in addition to, or in that consideration, they need to think about the shape and the size of those parks, because certain organisms are going to need a certain amount of space in order to successfully survive. And a lot of the times what they're going to do, or one thing that they could potentially do, is create corridors between these different protected areas. What that's going to do is allow more travel between those areas. It's essentially sort of, if you think about it, making these islands closer together. We're going to allow more transport between those locations. We're going to see more biodiversity in those locations. It's going to make them more stable in terms of the environment as a whole, but also it's going to make the populations more stable. But within these communities, what we're going to see is two sort of effects. One of them is going to occur in the core. What we're going to see is that a more isolated area. So we're often going to see the more specialized species located in that area. And then on the outside, we're going to have what are known as edge effects. So this could be sort of a different set of characteristics than the core. So if you're thinking about a forest, the outside may have more light just because it's going to be more exposed. Or if we're thinking about a grassland, the edges may be more shady just because they're going to have maybe more trees or something like that. So in these edges, we're going to have slightly different characteristics. And then within this picture here, we can kind of see just a model of what one of these systems may look like in terms of having that core area, the edge on the outside kind of serving as a buffer, because even outside of that would be, could be anything, could be just like a community, a city, whatever it's going to be. But within here, we're balancing the need for conservation and protection of these different organisms and systems, while also having the ability to monitor, perform research, learn about them, and then even include a little bit of tourism and recreation, things like that. So a system like this is probably the system that would be the most successful, just because it is going to balance out those large set of different factors. So again, we always have to consider environmental, social, cultural, economic, a whole bunch of different things. So a system like this is probably going to be the most widely acceptable sort of method. And then with this, again, so with chapters 5 and 6, we're kind of just looking at the biodiversity as a whole and sort of the threats, exactly how that plays out, and just a whole bunch of different factors in here. But if you have any questions on any of it, of course, always just make sure to let me know, and I'm happy to discuss any of the individual topics, or if there's anything else that you want to discuss, we can always look at those too.